Sarah was a hard-working woman with a sharp mind and a strong will. She had worked her way up to becoming a successful business consultant, helping companies make smart financial decisions. Despite the challenges she had faced in life, she always carried herself with confidence and treated everyone with kindness. She believed in fairness and respect, no matter who she was dealing with. One afternoon, Sarah walked into a quiet cafe in the city. She was dressed in a smart navy blue suit, her curly hair neatly styled, and a leather bag over her shoulder. She had come to grab a quick coffee before heading to an important meeting. The cafe was filled with the rich aroma of roasted coffee beans, and the soft hum of conversation floated through the air. As she stood in line, a man entered behind her. He was tall, well-dressed, and had a sharp, calculating gaze. His name was Mr. Dalton, a well-known lawyer in the city. He had a strong reputation for winning cases, but not everyone liked him. He was known for his arrogance and the way he looked down on others. He believed that his success made him better than most people. Sarah didn't notice him at first. She was checking her phone, going over some notes for her meeting. But then she heard a voice behind her. "Excuse me, can you take my order already? I don't have all day," Mr. Dalton said, his tone impatient. Sarah turned to look at him, surprised. He was staring at her as if she was an employee. It took her a moment to realize what was happening. He thought she worked there. She smiled politely. "Oh, I don't work here. I'm just a customer like you." Mr. Dalton frowned, clearly annoyed. "Oh, I see. Well, you were standing there like you were taking orders," he muttered, waving a dismissive hand. Sarah could feel a few eyes in the cafe turning toward them. Some people shifted uncomfortably, sensing the tension, but Sarah remained calm. She had dealt with people like this before, those who judged others too quickly. She wasn't going to let it ruin her day. She simply nodded and turned back toward the counter. The barista called for the next customer, and Sarah stepped forward to order her coffee. She could still feel Mr. Dalton's presence behind her, but she ignored him. When her coffee was ready, she picked it up and walked toward a table near the window. She didn't think much more about the rude encounter, focusing instead on her upcoming meeting. But she had no idea that this wasn't the last time she would see Mr. Dalton. Their paths were about to cross again, only this time it would be in a place where he would regret ever underestimating her. A week passed since the cafe incident, and Sarah had almost forgotten about it. She had been busy with her work, helping businesses improve their strategies and grow. She loved what she did, and she took pride in the fact that she had built her career through hard work and determination. One morning, Sarah received an email from a law firm regarding a business dispute involving one of her clients. It was a big case, and Sarah had been asked to assist as a key witness. She read through the details carefully and made a note of the law firm handling the case. As she scrolled down, her eyes stopped at a familiar name, Mr. Dalton. For a moment, she couldn't believe it. The same man who had treated her so rudely at the cafe was going to be the opposing lawyer in this case. Sarah let out a small chuckle, shaking her head. Life had a funny way of bringing people back together, and this time, she would be meeting Mr. Dalton in a professional setting, where she had full control over her expertise. She wasn't nervous. If anything, she was ready. She knew her facts well, and she had years of experience in business consulting. If Mr. Dalton underestimated her again, it would be his mistake. The day of the court hearing arrived, and Sarah walked into the courtroom with confidence. She wore a sleek black blazer over a white blouse, looking every bit the professional she was. As she took her seat, she noticed Mr. Dalton at the other table, discussing something with his legal team. He hadn't seen her yet. The room was filled with the quiet murmurs of lawyers, clients, and court officials preparing for the session. Sarah glanced around, taking in the atmosphere. The case involved a major business contract dispute, and her testimony would play a crucial role in proving the facts. Then, the moment came. Mr. Dalton finally turned and noticed her. His expression shifted from focus to complete surprise. For a brief second, he looked as if he couldn't place where he had seen her before. Then, realization dawned on his face. His eyes slightly widened, and his posture stiffened. Sarah met his gaze with a calm, polite smile, as if nothing unusual had happened. But deep inside, she could tell, he remembered. He remembered the cafe, the way he had dismissed her. And now, he was realizing that she wasn't just another customer. She was a professional, sitting across from him as a key figure in this case. Mr. Dalton quickly masked his reaction, adjusting his tie and straightening his papers. He had no choice but to proceed with the case, but Sarah knew one thing for sure. This time, he wouldn't be able to ignore her so easily. The real test was about to begin, and Mr. Dalton was about to learn a lesson he would never forget. The courtroom was silent as the judge entered, and everyone rose to their feet. Sarah remained calm, her hands folded neatly in her lap as she observed the scene around her. This was an important case, and she had prepared thoroughly. She had all the facts, evidence, and knowledge needed to assist her client. Meanwhile, across the room, Mr. Dalton sat stiffly, his usual confidence slightly shaken. He had spent years building his reputation as a fierce lawyer, someone who could intimidate his opponents. But today, he found himself unsettled. The woman he had brushed off so rudely in the cafe was now seated as a key witness against his client. He had assumed she was just another ordinary person, yet here she was, calm, composed, and ready to speak with authority. The proceedings began, and Mr. Dalton wasted no time presenting his arguments. He spoke smoothly, his voice firm as he laid out his client's side of the case. He was trying to prove that his client had not breached the business contract and that Sarah's client was at fault. He expected to take full control of the situation, as he always did. But Sarah wasn't intimidated. When the judge called her to the stand, she walked up with steady steps, her head held high. She took the oath and sat down, ready to face whatever questions came her way. Mr. Dalton approached with his usual commanding presence, but there was something different in his eyes now, a hint of hesitation. "Miss Sarah, as a business consultant, you claim to have reviewed the contract thoroughly. Can you prove that my client did not meet the agreed terms?" he asked, his voice carrying a sharp edge. Sarah met his gaze directly and replied smoothly, "Yes, I can." She then pulled out the documents she had prepared, flipping to the exact section of the contract that showed the violation. She explained it in simple, clear terms, making it easy for everyone in the courtroom to understand. As she spoke, Mr. Dalton's confidence began to waver. He had expected her to stumble, to struggle under pressure, but she did the exact opposite. She explained everything with precision, countering his arguments without hesitation. The judge listened carefully, occasionally nodding in understanding. Even the jury seemed to be taking in every word she said. Mr. Dalton tried to regain control, asking more questions, but Sarah responded to each one with facts and logic. The more he tried to corner her, the more he realized he had underestimated her. By the time she finished her testimony, the room was silent. Mr. Dalton hesitated for a brief moment before clearing his throat. "No further questions, Your Honor," he said, stepping away from the stand. Sarah returned to her seat, feeling the weight of her victory already settling in. She hadn't won the case yet, but she had won something just as important: Mr. Dalton's realization that he had made a huge mistake in judging her. And the best part, the real lesson was still to come. The courtroom remained silent for a moment after Sarah finished her testimony. Mr. Dalton returned to his seat, shuffling his papers as if trying to regain his usual composure. But it was clear, something had changed. The confidence he had walked in with had been shaken. Sarah wasn't just another witness. She was sharp, well-prepared, and completely unshaken by his usual tactics. Sarah sat calmly, watching as the judge took notes, and the jury absorbed everything that had been said. Her client, seated beside her, gave her an approving nod. She knew she had done her part well, but the case wasn't over yet. Now it was Mr. Dalton's turn to try and turn things around. The next witness was called, an executive from Mr. Dalton's client's company. Mr. Dalton straightened his tie and approached the witness stand with renewed energy. He was determined to regain control of the case. He began asking questions, carefully guiding the witness to answer in a way that would support his arguments. For a while, it seemed like he was managing to shift the focus away from Sarah's testimony. The executive spoke with confidence, trying to paint their company in a positive light. Mr. Dalton even stole a few glances at Sarah, as if expecting her to look uneasy. But she remained completely composed, watching everything closely. Then something happened that no one expected. As the executive answered another one of Mr. Dalton's questions, he hesitated slightly. It was just for a second, but Sarah caught it. She had been in business consulting long enough to recognize when someone was being careful with their words. Too careful. Sarah leaned slightly toward her lawyer and whispered, "Ask for their financial records. Something doesn't add up." Her lawyer gave her a curious look, but nodded. When it was time for cross-examination, Sarah's lawyer stood up and confidently requested the company's financial records. At first, the executive looked unbothered, but when Sarah's lawyer pressed further, asking about specific transactions, a nervous look crossed the executive's face. The judge allowed the request, and soon, key documents were handed over. As Sarah's lawyer flipped through them, Sarah spotted what she was looking for, a clear sign that the company had been dishonest in their reports. Mr. Dalton frowned, sensing the shift in the room. His witness, who had spoken so confidently moments ago, now looked pale. The records showed that the company had, in fact, breached the contract exactly as Sarah had explained. There was no denying it anymore. Mr. Dalton's jaw tightened. He had walked into this courtroom believing he had the upper hand. He had assumed Sarah was just another person who wouldn't stand a chance against him. But now, in front of everyone, it was clear he was losing control of the case. Sarah remained quiet, her expression calm, but inside, she knew the truth. Karma was already catching up to Mr. Dalton. And the best part, it wasn't over yet. The tension in the courtroom grew thick as Sarah's lawyer continued flipping through the financial records. The air felt heavy with realization. Mr. Dalton's case was falling apart, piece by piece. The executive on the witness stand shifted uncomfortably, his confidence from earlier now completely gone. Mr. Dalton tried to regain control. He quickly stood up, adjusting his suit jacket as he addressed the judge. "Your Honor, I believe this information is being misinterpreted. My client has been fully transparent about their business dealings." But Sarah's lawyer wasn't going to let him twist the facts. If that's true, then Mr. Dalton should have no objection to reviewing these numbers in detail, he said smoothly, turning toward the jury. He then pointed to a section of the documents. According to these records, the company claimed to have met the contract's terms. However, just a few weeks before the deadline, there was an unexpected transaction, one that directly contradicts those claims. Mr. Dalton's witness swallowed hard. The entire room was now focused on the evidence. The judge leaned forward, inspecting the documents carefully. The jury members exchanged looks, some even nodding as they connected the dots. Sarah stayed silent, watching it all unfold. She had seen this moment coming from the start. Mr. Dalton had underestimated her, assuming she wouldn't have the knowledge or confidence to challenge him. But now, with the facts laid bare, he was the one struggling to keep his case together. The judge turned to Mr. Dalton's client. "Do you have an explanation for this discrepancy?" The executive hesitated. He glanced at Mr. Dalton, as if hoping for guidance, but there was nothing Mr. Dalton could do now. The truth was already in the open. I wasn't aware of this specific transaction," the executive finally muttered, avoiding eye contact. A low murmur spread through the courtroom. Everyone knew what that meant. Either the company had been dishonest, or they had made critical mistakes they couldn't cover up anymore. Mr. Dalton clenched his jaw, realizing there was no way to spin the situation in his favor. He took a slow breath, trying to think of a way out, but there was none. The evidence was too strong. Sarah remained composed, though inside, she felt a quiet sense of satisfaction. not because she had wanted to embarrass anyone, but because the truth had won. She believed in fairness, and now justice was unfolding right before her eyes. The judge cleared his throat, bringing order back to the room. "We will take a short recess before proceeding with further arguments," he announced. As people began standing and stretching, Mr. Dalton glanced toward Sarah. For the first time, there was no arrogance in his expression, only frustration and disbelief. He had walked into this courtroom expecting an easy win, but now he knew he had made the biggest mistake of his career. And Sarah, she simply gave him a polite, knowing smile before turning away. The lesson wasn't over yet. As the court recessed, the atmosphere felt tense. People gathered in small groups, quietly discussing the case, while others stood alone, looking over their notes. Sarah sat at her table, reviewing her own thoughts. She had prepared for this moment, but there was still a feeling of anticipation in the air. The room was filled with hushed voices, all waiting for the next part of the trial. Mr. Dalton, looking visibly shaken, walked toward his team of lawyers. His usual confident stride had turned into something more unsure. He had faced many difficult situations in his career, but this was different. This wasn't a case of winning or losing. It felt personal. He had underestimated Sarah, and now he had to deal with the consequences. Sarah, on the other hand, didn't feel triumphant or vindictive. She wasn't there to tear anyone down. She had simply done her job, and the truth was speaking for itself. She felt confident in her actions, but she also understood the delicate balance of fairness. No matter the outcome, it was important to her that the right thing was done. The break lasted for about 20 minutes. During that time, Sarah took a few moments to refresh her mind and calm her nerves. She had been through many business challenges, but this court case felt different. The stakes were higher, and the eyes of the courtroom were now focused on every word she spoke. When the judge called everyone back into session, Sarah walked back into the courtroom with the same calm confidence as before. Mr. Dalton, though trying to hide it, looked frustrated. He hadn't had time to recover from the last blow, and now it was his turn to face Sarah's lawyer again. The proceedings continued, but now Sarah's presence in the room had shifted the balance. She wasn't just a witness anymore. She had become a force to be reckoned with. As Sarah's lawyer made his closing statements, he skillfully reinforced the points she had made earlier, using her testimony and the financial records to back up every claim. Mr. Dalton tried to salvage what he could, throwing in his final arguments, but it was clear that his earlier mistake had cost him. He was grasping at straws, trying to find a way to convince the jury that his client wasn't at fault, but the evidence was overwhelming. Sarah sat back, listening to both sides, but she knew the truth had already been revealed. There was no convincing the jury that her client was wrong when all the facts pointed in the opposite direction. Mr. Dalton was starting to lose his usual swagger. The judge nodded thoughtfully, taking in the arguments. He didn't rush his decision, but it was clear from his expression that he understood the gravity of the case. After a few more moments of deliberation, the judge finally spoke, addressing the court. "We will proceed with the jury's deliberation," he said, signaling the final phase of the trial. As the jury filed out of the room to discuss their verdict, Sarah couldn't help but glance over at Mr. Dalton. His face was pale, and he had his arms crossed tightly. He no longer looked like the confident lawyer he had been when the trial started. The moment he had dismissed her at the cafe seemed like a distant memory, and now he was facing the consequences of his misjudgment. Sarah didn't feel pity for him. She simply felt a sense of justice. The pieces were in place, and the truth was clear. No one could hide behind arrogance or misinformation forever. The courtroom was filled with an uneasy silence as the jury filed back in. Sarah sat quietly, her eyes fixed on the jury as they took their seats. The air in the room felt thick, heavy with anticipation. The moment everyone had been waiting for was approaching: the jury's verdict. Mr. Dalton, now visibly anxious, sat stiffly in his chair, his gaze flickering nervously toward the jury box. He had spent his entire career building a reputation as a sharp and successful lawyer. But now, faced with the undeniable facts Sarah had presented, he knew this case was slipping away from him. His earlier confidence had evaporated, replaced by a quiet unease he couldn't shake. Sarah, on the other hand, remained composed. She didn't need to worry about the outcome now. She had done everything in her power to ensure the truth was heard. She had presented the evidence, explained the contract, and shown the financial discrepancies. Now it was in the hands of the jury, and all she could do was wait. The judge glanced around the room, then turned his attention to the jury. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" he asked in his calm, authoritative voice. One of the jurors, a woman in her 40s, stood up and walked to the front. She held the folded piece of paper with the jury's decision in her hand. The room held its breath as she handed it to the judge. The judge slowly unfolded the paper, his eyes scanning it as he read the verdict. The tension in the room seemed to stretch on forever as everyone waited for the official words to be spoken. Finally, the judge cleared his throat and addressed the courtroom. In the case of plaintiff versus defendant, the jury finds in favor of the plaintiff. The defendant is responsible for breaching the terms of the contract. There was a brief moment of silence before the room erupted into soft murmurs. Sarah's lawyer gave her a quick, approving glance, while Sarah simply nodded, a small, satisfied smile crossing her face. She hadn't expected anything less. The facts had been clear from the beginning, and now the truth had won out. Mr. Dalton, however, sat frozen. He stared at the judge as if he hadn't quite processed what had just happened. He had lost. After all his effort, all his pressure, and his attempts to twist the situation, he was now faced with a defeat he hadn't seen coming. His mind raced, trying to find an explanation, a way out. But it was too late. The jury had made their decision, and there was no turning back. The judge banged his gavel, signaling the end of the trial. "This court is adjourned," he declared, and with that, the formal proceedings came to an end. Sarah gathered her things, standing slowly as she prepared to leave the courtroom. She didn't feel any need for a dramatic celebration or victory speech. She had done her job, and now the result was clear. But she couldn't help but feel a small sense of pride. She had been true to herself, and in the end, the truth had prevailed. As she made her way out of the courtroom, she noticed Mr. Dalton standing alone at his table, his shoulders slumped. There was no smug smile, no air of superiority, just a man who had been humbled. Sarah didn't hold any ill will toward him. He had learned a hard lesson today, one that she hoped would stay with him. Before leaving, Sarah took one last glance at the courtroom. It wasn't about proving herself to Mr. Dalton or anyone else. It was about standing up for what was right. And today, that was exactly what she had done. As Sarah walked out of the courtroom, the weight of the trial slowly lifted off her shoulders. The crisp air outside felt refreshing, like a new chapter had just begun. She had done what she set out to do, not out of a need for revenge or to prove anyone wrong, but simply to stand for what was right. The truth had been heard, and that was all that mattered to her. She paused for a moment, taking in the view of the busy city street ahead of her. People were going about their day, unaware of the drama that had just unfolded in the courtroom. Sarah was ready to return to her life, but something about today felt different. It wasn't just the case that had been won, but the realization that sometimes the universe has a way of bringing everything full circle. The man who had once belittled her had been forced to face the consequences of his actions, not through anger or hostility, but through simple truth. As she made her way to her car, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out to see a text from her client, thanking her for her hard work and expertise in the case. It was exactly what she needed, a reminder that her efforts had made a difference, not just for herself, but for the people who trusted her. Sarah typed a quick reply, feeling the satisfaction of knowing her client would walk away from this with a just outcome. Mr. Dalton's defeat wasn't something she celebrated, but she did feel a sense of closure. He had underestimated her, and now, in a very real way, he had learned that respect goes both ways. It wasn't just about business or law. It was about the people behind those roles. She had done her job with integrity and professionalism, and that was something she could always be proud of. Later that evening, Sarah reflected on the events of the day. She thought about how Mr. Dalton had dismissed her at the cafe, how he had assumed she was nothing more than an ordinary woman, just another face in the crowd. And now, in the courtroom, he had learned a valuable lesson. She wasn't just someone he could look down upon. She was a professional, someone who could hold her own, no matter the situation. Sarah smiled to herself. It wasn't about rubbing it in his face or getting even. It was about having the courage to stand tall and speak the truth, no matter who was on the other side. She believed in the power of doing what was right, even when the world seemed to be stacked against you. As the day drew to a close, Sarah couldn't help but feel grateful for the lesson she had learned herself. Never let anyone define who you are, and never let anyone underestimate the strength you carry inside. The world would always try to make you feel small, but as long as you stood firm in your own truth, no one could ever take that away from you. The case was over, but the impact it had left on everyone involved was just beginning. For Sarah, it was a reminder that sometimes the best way to face adversity is with patience, grace, and unwavering confidence in your own worth. And as she looked out at the setting sun, she knew that no matter what came next, she was ready to take on the world.